Hi, so this is a brief video going over the research write-up project. So earlier in the semester, you participated in a survey that asked you some questions related to well-being, perceived anxiety, sleep quality, and the amount of sleep. And so you're going to be working to do a write-up of this project. And so I do have a couple of resources for you in a Google Drive and also located in our Canvas under the research project module. And so the first thing to do is going to be thinking about picking one DV and one IV for our first comparison with t-tests. What research question do you have? For a t-test is comparing two groups, an independent t-test, and you're going to compare them on one outcome. And so you're going to formulate a research question based on that, and that is what you're going to report for your t-test. I'm going to give you more data than that. The next thing you're going to do is to pick two variables, two of our outcome variables, our dependent variables, and identify how are they related to each other. And that's running or reporting one correlation. Again, I'm going to run them all for you. You also are going to be going through and creating answering a couple questions about how do we operationally define the variables. So you're given that information. It'll be discussed in class. The method, so conducting the survey, and then writing up the results section. So I wanted to take a moment and go ahead and review the results section. So this is data output from Jamovi, which is some open software that's used in the Introduction to Statistics lab. You will see that you will identify which results match your research questions. So you can see for this first one, we are actually looking at making a comparison between males versus females. And so that's going to be our first test statistic. And then if you were interested in gender differences, you would go ahead and report one of these T's. So this is your actual T, and then this is the p-value. And then we always report effect size, which is the Cohen's d. All right, so you're going to pick one of these. And again, this first results corresponds with the males versus females. The next part of it goes over assumptions, and so there actually is some violations of assumptions for well-being and for sleep hours. And what that means is normality is, does it have a normal, nice bell curve? And so we don't meet that assumption, which is important for a t-test. So that's something to note if you are running one of those. The next one is comparing the variances between the two groups, males versus females, and are they similar enough? And again, this shows, it's assumption test, it shows that they're similar enough. So that was good. You then have, when you report your t-test, you're also going to report the descriptives for the two groups. And so this goes through, again, you would just be reporting, if you're reporting well-being, you would report these, or perceived anxiety, or the sleep quality, or the sleep hours. And so you would, again, identify what was appropriate. The next section is the graphs. So you could see the graphs for our 4 DVs. Again, you're just focusing on one. The next section is, again, t-tests. But now these t-tests go through and do asynchronous versus taking some sort of face-to-face component. So there was a question, what modality is the majority of your classes? If you're interested in comparing differences based on students' modality, you again would connect back to one of these outcome variables. And again, this is the T, this is the P values. Again, you want P less than 0.05, so none of those are significant. and that's our effect size, which you ignore the negative sign for those. So again, you would look at and identify, do they meet the assumptions? So we do have one issue with sleep hours. So if you were choosing to compare modality for sleep hours, you would need to know we didn't meet that assumption, which is actually important that you meet it, but we didn't. For equality of variance, which is another important assumption for independent t-test, not a dependent t-test, we are all good there. So that is nice. And again, after you report your t, you are also going to report the descriptives. And so this is where you would find reporting the means and the standard deviations for your two groups. And again, you'd pick the IB if you're interested in modality. And then again, there are plots, different graphs for the different outcomes. The next set of t-tests is comparing, what is it comparing? Oh, it's comparing traditional and non-traditional students. So again, this one is traditional versus non-traditional. So did you start college right out of high school, or did you wait and you're kind of coming back? So again, if you're interested in comparing traditional and non-traditional students, again, you're just going to pick one of these dependent variables, and then there's your t, here's your effect size, and again, you want these p's less than 0.05, so none of them are significant. You also need to identify assumptions. So we do have violations of assumptions. Again, sleep quality and sleep hours don't have the normal bell curve. So again, that would be something to report if you chose to do sleep. And then for homogeneity of variance, we do have an issue with the perceived anxiety scale. So that means when you look at traditional students, variation, and you look at non-traditional students, variation, they're two different. So again, that is not good for running an independent t-test, but that's what we've learned in this class. So you just would report that violation. And again, you have descriptives. And so again, you would pick one of these that fits with. If you chose to do traditional, non-traditional, you would report the means and you would report the standard deviations. And you'd also report the ends because there's unequal sample sizes. You'll notice for this last group, sleep hours, there's less than the other three. Just means they left that blank. Didn't respond. Then there's plots for graphs for those. Okay. And then our last t-test is comparing, just for fun, do we see differences for students who filled the survey out in the fall versus students who filled it out in the spring? All right, and so maybe that's a research question you were interested in. Again, you'd pick one of the outcome variables. These are your T's, these are your P's, and we do have one significant finding, and these are your effect size. All right, so we'd be reporting that. Again, we'd also want to check into assumptions. So normality, we do have an issue with the sleep hours. So again, I'd report that if I was choosing to do the comparison with sleep hours. And then our homogeneity of variance, there's differences in variance for the fall students versus the spring students. And that would be something I would report if I had chosen that. Again, then after you report your T, it's important you do the descriptive. So F is fall, S is spring, and then you have your 4 outcomes. So you'd pick yours, you'd report the means and the standard deviations. And again, you can make some interpretations from those things by looking at the information I gave you about each item. And then you've got your graphs. So here we did have significant findings for perceived anxiety. And it looks like the spring students had more perceived anxiety than the fall students. So that's kind of unfortunate and an interesting thing to think about. So the t-test is one part of the write-up. The other report of the write-up is a correlation, which we're going to learn about soon. A correlation looks at 2 variables and how are they related And so again, think back to your t-test research question and then think about one correlation that would connect with that. So if I picked perceived anxiety for my t-test, and then I picked again one of those different comparisons of the two groups, I then might compare, well, what is the relationship between perceived anxiety and well-being? And so here you can see that the first line you get is going to be the Pearson's R and then the p-value. And the p-value, you want p less than 0.05, right? So this is the relationship between well-being and perceived anxiety. This is the relationship between well-being and sleep quality. This is the relationship between well-being and sleep hours. This is the relationship between anxiety and sleep. And then this is the relationship between anxiety and sleep hours. And then this is the relationship between reports of sleep quality and reports of sleep hours. So again, you'd be reporting one of those correlations, and you'd report the R and you report the P, and the other thing that you're going to want to report is the R squared, which literally equals you take your R value times your R value. So R squared we've learned about, it's the effect size for R. And so again, this is just a quick review. In your Google folder, you have the directions for the write-up, information about the scales, a peer review form that you're going to use for exchanging drafts, and then this output form for you.